everybody. Very nice to welcome you here today. My name is Claire Piggiskill. I'm the keeper of the University of Nottingham Museum, and a very warm welcome here today. And I'm amazed that everybody's able to get here through the cold and the ice and the snow. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome back Dr Gareth Williams. I know some of you were here before when he spoke before. Gareth is curator of early medieval coins and Viking collections at the British Museum. And he's also honorary reader in archaeology at University College London. He's currently senior researcher on the Viking Phenomenon project at the University of Uppsala. And as part of this, he's working on books on Viking warfare and military organisation, as well as activities of the great armies of the late 9th century. He's also completing an edited volume of the Vale of York Hoard and other Viking Hoards from England. So, without further ado, it is an absolute pleasure to hand you over to Dr Gareth Williams, who will be speaking about Viking Hoards and the making of England.
Thank you, Claire. Can everyone hear me all right?
No, only just.
Okay. Is that better?
Better.
Good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be back here and to be talking on this subject of Viking Hoards. I don't know whether you've all seen the exhibition yet, but you've got one of the best collections of Viking Hoards from England ever put together under one roof here just at the moment. And in fact, although this is a touring exhibition, it includes one hoard in particular, the Watlington hoard, found a couple of years ago in Oxfordshire, which is only coming to this venue. So this is the best place to see it, at least if you like hoards, which I do. Without further ado, what do I mean by hoards? Well, hoards is a general term given to large or small groups of precious metal material put into the ground. And there's a number of reasons why hoards might be placed into the ground. It's always difficult to say with absolute certainty why any particular hoard was buried, and there's a number of possible explanations. The first is a straightforward storage of wealth, and this could be long-term storage. It could be in response to a particular short-term crisis. So in some cases, we do seem to see material being accumulated over a number of years, and sometimes you can even see layers within a hoard, which suggests it's been built up over time. Other times, it all seems to be put in at once, and sometimes the hoards can be dated in relation to known historical events that suggest there may be a connection. Some hoards have been seen as the stock in trade of jewellers. I'm not going to go into that as a possibility too much today because it's not relevant to any of the ones that I'm going to be talking about in detail. Another possibility is that the removal from circulation was an important act in itself. The Viking Age is extraordinary for the transformation in Viking society in terms of the use of precious metal. At the beginning of the Viking Age, there's very little precious metal in use in Scandinavia at all. What there wasn't used in any sort of monetary sense. It was only used for display. And one of the things that changes is that as the Viking world expanded both in the east and the west, they got access to new supplies of precious metal, particularly silver, but to a lesser extent gold. That came in basically as a raw material for turning into display items. But after a while, they actually got more of it than they could possibly display. I'll show you some Viking display items later, and they're large and impractical. And there's a limit to the number of large and impractical items that you can actually wear. So once you've acquired too much wealth, how can you show it off? Well, one way you can show it off is by effectively destroying it, saying, I'm so wealthy, I don't even need to wear it, I can just bury it in the ground and nobody else knows where it is. So that's a possibility. And indeed there is an account in Egil's saga of the great Viking hero Egil Skallagrimsson taking his accumulated wealth. Initially, his plan is to take it to the Althing, the Icelandic assembly, and throw it among the crowd, so there'll be a huge fight and he'll be remembered forever. And strangely enough, his family aren't keen on that idea because they want to keep it for themselves, so they go to the Althing without him, leaving him at home, and he goes off into the middle of nowhere with his treasure and a couple of slaves, and returns a couple of days later alone, and neither the treasure nor the slaves are ever found again. And people are talking about it even today. So he's sort of achieved his aim there. Another possibility, and this is something that we find in the writings of Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic saga writer, this is Odin's law, the idea that you would enjoy in the afterlife the benefit of anything that you buried in the ground while you were alive. Now, I'm not sure I believe in this, not least because it doesn't really fit very well with the other accounts that we have of Viking afterlife. If you're going to Valhalla and everything is provided, what do you spend your hoard on in the afterlife? You've got all the mead that you can drink, you've got all the goat that you can eat, and there's nothing else on offer. You can't really use it much. So I think it's just an explanation that's been put forward in the 13th century for the hoards that they were turning up at that time. Why would these people a couple of hundred years ago, but I know they used to worship Odin then. So it's there in the sagas, but I'm not sure I believe it. And another possible explanation, and this is something that archaeologists always fall back on if they can't explain things any other way, it's a votive offering to the gods. And some hoards, that does seem possible. If a hoard is placed somewhere where there's no chance that it could ever be recovered, so if you throw your hoard into a bog or into the sea, it's unlikely that you're going back for it, in which case that's a possibility. So when it comes to trying to interpret individual hoards, there's a number of things that we can look at. When was it buried? Does that give us any clues? Was it a time of particular emergency? Where was it buried? And there we can start from the immediate spot. Is it, for example, inside a house? On the island of Gotland, a lot of the hoards there, and there's a huge concentration, they're mostly found inside houses, so people were burying them under their own floors. In other cases, they seem to be deliberately buried in the middle of nowhere so that no one can see while the burial is taking place. So we can look at the immediate find spot, we can look at the surrounding landscape, we can look at the wider region and interpret the hoards in the light of that geographical setting. We can look at the nature of the contents, what's actually being hoarded, and we can look at the size. And the hoards vary from the contents of a purse to the one I showed in the opening slide, the Curedale hoard, which is 40 kilos of silver, 7,500 coins, about 1,000 other objects. And there are even bigger ones elsewhere in the Viking world. Now, the material in the hoard reflects a variety of different types of use of silver. And as I said at the beginning of the Viking Age, the only real use for silver was display, showing off how wealthy you are by wearing your wealth. That then gives rise to a demand for silver to turn into status items, and people realised that actually silver was quite a useful form of currency, just valued by weight. And this was a period in which there were probably a variety of types of what we call commodity money. So commodities that could be weighed or measured in set amounts, which could then be used as a means of exchange, as a storage of wealth. They've got the basic functions of money despite not being coins. So dried fish, for example, is something that we see. Whether or not it starts to have that function in the Viking Age, it certainly has it after that. Even in modern times, you can see books in Iceland, for example, as late as the 18th century, possibly even the 19th, with a price in fish on the cover. It only works with dried fish. Wet fish don't hold their value. And you can use grain in set measures, you can use butter in set measures as well. Precious metal holds its value better than most, so this bullion economy takes off. The Vikings also came into contact with various coin-using economies, the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks in continental Europe, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphate, and so on. And so they became familiar with coin-using and started, in many cases, issuing coins of their own. And then you've got crossovers between these different types of economy. So, for example, you can have weight-adjusted jewellery, so it's jewellery of a set weight and therefore of a set value, which is also a display item. You can have coins which get turned into jewellery, but are nevertheless recognisably coins. And the great thing about all of these forms of silver use, and the same applies to gold as well, is you can melt anything down and turn it into something else. So let's just see a few examples before we go on to the hoards themselves. For example, here we see a status item. This is a brooch. It's about that long, the pin. So it's worn on my shoulder with the point sticking up. It's not practical in a crowd. It's clear evidence that Vikings never had to travel on the tube. It's really something that would only be suitable for wearing in your high seat in the hall as a chieftain. The weight of it, if you're actually using it to secure a cloak, it would actually sort of drag the cloak down to your navel. It's not a practical item. And there are a number of these stupidly heavy items. It's showing that you can afford to be stupid, basically. And just think modern designer shoes. You know, they're not comfortable, you can't walk in them, but you can at least show that you can afford the label. It's the same sort of principle. Then we've got bullion. We've got evidence for this in the form of weights, balances, bars of silver, and what we call hack silver, chopped up pieces of either ingots or chopped up pieces of jewellery. There's an example from a crucible. These are chopped up coins and ingots, all partially melted together and then lost partway through a melt. And they're examples of weight-adjusted jewellery. These coiled spirals, that started off as a neck ring, like the larger ones around it. It's been recoiled into an arm ring. This particular type is known initially from the Viking settlements in Russia, but then spreads across the Viking world. And we have fragments of them in a number of the hoards from the British Isles. And we have an account from an Arab traveller who encountered the Vikings in Russia, and he said that when a Viking trader acquired 10,000 dirhams, that's the main Islamic coin, then he would have a neck ring made for his wife. Now, the whole 10,000 wouldn't go into a neck ring. That would be far too heavy to wear, especially since he said, and when he got another 10,000, then the wife got another neck ring, and so on. It would be impractical. But what these rings do, they're a standard weight, and so they probably do signify possession of a certain amount of wealth. So in wearing it, it's like wearing your Rolex watch with the price tag still attached, so everyone knows just how much you're worth. We also have jewellery that's turned into bullion. It's no longer wearable. Here we've got a flattened arm ring. This should be worn around the arm, but it's been flattened. It's no longer wearable. The same with these, an entire hoard on the right from Huxley in Cheshire that turned up a few years ago. It's entirely made of flattened arm rings. A couple of them have had bits cut off, so we can see those as hack silver. Mostly they're intact, but no longer wearable. And what we can also see with a number of hoards is a mixture of all these different types of items. So the Goldsborough hoard here, you can see an intact brooch in the middle of it. That one's a bit smaller, that one's only about so long, so that's actually wearable. Is that being valued for itself as an item of jewellery? Is it only valued as bullion? Well, it could be both at the same time. It's surrounded with definite bullion items, but also some complete coins. It's not the whole hoard here. There were a lot of coins, not all of which can now be found. A number of them were mislaid, shall we say, by one of my predecessors at the British Museum in the 19th century. I traced some of them a few years ago on tickets saying, "Found in Mr. Vokes' table." But We're more careful now. So we have these mixed hoards reflecting different types of economy. And then you have pure coin hoards. This is something that's more typical of the Anglo-Saxons. They have a very controlled coin economy. This particular hoard limits other types. It's only the current type. Other coin types are excluded from circulation. This is something we very seldom see in a Viking context. It's more common in an Anglo-Saxon context, but the Vikings do develop this as well. And then let's come back to this one. This is, as I said, a huge hoard. This is probably the most famous Viking hoard from the British Isles, over 40 kilos, as I said, of silver. And this hoard, until relatively recently, completely dominated our understanding of Viking hoards. It's completely atypical. It's so much larger than anything else. But we didn't have many other major Viking hoards. In the 20 years since I've been working at the British Museum, we keep getting more. And I've begged the finds liaison officers of the Portable Antiquities Scheme to tell the metal detectorists to stop finding them because I haven't finished publishing the ones we've got yet, and it gets difficult as they find more and more. But they take no notice, they carry on finding them. So it's an ongoing challenge. But amongst those, there are a couple of particularly important ones, and it's these two that I'm going to talk about today. They're important not just because they're nice piles of shiny metal which you can admire across the road, and we also have part of the Curedale hoard in the exhibition across the way as well. But what's interesting about both of these hoards I'm going to talk about today, the Watlington hoard and the Vale of York hoard, is they help us rewrite history, because the history that we have of this period is very, very patchy. Now, historians writing today don't tend to write as if that's the case. They construct as clear a picture as they can from incomplete evidence and then write it as if we actually know everything. And we don't. And particularly what we do know is largely for this period what the West Saxon court wants us to know. Almost everything that we have for the late 9th century going through into the early 10th century is the product of effectively the press machine of Alfred the Great's court and his successors. Just think forward to a few hundred years from now and imagine if the only thing that future generations had to tell us about 2017 was what the White House press office chose to issue. And that's what we've constructed our understanding of history around. A very spare set of events that we have to interpret. And these are written down, to make things worse, a few years after the event, normally, rather than at the time. Now, the hoards are, in their nature, inherently contemporary. So they represent the situation at the time that they were buried, not as written or perhaps rewritten a little bit later. And that's really what I want to talk about today. So turning first to the Watlington hoard, this was discovered in 2015 near Watlington in Oxfordshire. It's found by a metal detectorist, James Mather, and he uncovered the first few items himself and then realised that he'd got a whole hoard there and very properly reported it to the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and the local finds liaison officer went out and excavated the hoard with James. So James was there sort of detecting around the fringes to establish just how far it might go. There was a single large lump and that was excavated as a block and brought to the British Museum, where it could then be investigated in detail, because they were concerned that news might get round and someone else might come along and help themselves to it. So the landowner had his tractor parked over it for the few days before it could actually be excavated. It's very, very fragmentary. There's something in the soil condition that means that the coins in this have been more fragmented than usual. Altogether, we've got around 200 silver coins in the hoard. but I say around because we just cannot be precise. The hoard's now been acquired by the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and they've, for a short time at least, got a conservator working full-time on trying to piece together some of the tiny fragments. So when it came through the treasure process and I was working on it, I pieced together what I could at that stage, but some of the pieces are so small we'll probably never know the exact number, but a little bit over 200. I think 211 was my best guess, but that may change slightly in terms of coins. We've then got 7 items of jewellery, some complete, some incomplete, and 15 silver ingots. So straight away what we've got is one of the mixed hoards that I was talking about. We've got complete jewellery, we've got bullion items, both of hack silver and ingots, and we've got coins. So let's just see a few examples. This is an armouring quite typical of the Irish Sea area. Another silver armouring that could come from almost anywhere in the Viking world, but both the combination of different object types and my jewellery is straight away shouting Viking Hoard. We then turn to hack silver, and this is a piece from a broadband armouring, again typical of the Irish Sea area. And very interestingly, one piece of hack gold. Now, hack gold is something which wasn't known at all until recently in this country. So although there was use of gold for status objects, we're now seeing a gold bullion economy. Gold ingots are turning up, and finds of hack gold. What's particularly interesting is we've got a concentration of hack gold in this country where it's in datable context from the 870s, and that's something I'll come back to. So here's this one piece from this hoard. There's a couple of other pieces from a site I'm working on in Yorkshire, and this is a site which can be dated to the mid-870s, and it's a large Viking camp. And then we've got the coins, and the coins are mostly Anglo-Saxon. They're mostly Anglo-Saxon silver pennies. There are a few exceptions. So we've got this, which is not the most prepossessing item in the hoard, it must be said, but this is probably the earliest surviving, or well, surviving is quite the right word, the earliest partially surviving English halfpenny. So this is slightly smaller. Halfpennies come in the 870s and were then used for around a century or so after that. Whereupon they gave up in the 970s, and if they wanted smaller coins than a penny, they just cut them into halves and quarters. But for a century or so we have halfpennies, and this seems to be the earliest example that we've got, and this dates probably from early in the reign of Alfred the Great, so early 870s, but possibly even from before that. There's no legible inscription on it at all. We also have 2 Frankish coins imported from the continent. Now, at this point, foreign coin was largely excluded from circulation in Anglo-Saxon contexts, whereas the Vikings didn't care where their coins came from as long as they were good silver. So you get Frankish and Anglo. So again, it's all pointing to Viking coinage. And then we've got the Anglo-Saxon coins themselves. And these are interesting because they are of 2 rulers predominantly. Alfred the Great of Wessex, who ruled from 871 to 899. And Alfred is probably the best known Anglo-Saxon king of them all. And then, as well as Alfred, we have coins of Ceolwulf II of Mercia, that well-known household name. He is not one of the best-known Anglo-Saxon kings. He's one of the least known, but what we do know about him is not very creditable. We are told that he was a foolish king's thane, which implies that he was a minor noble who was given the kingship of Mercia by the Vikings and basically ruled as a puppet, promised to hand it back to them whenever they wanted it. So he doesn't have a very good press. Now we have within this hoard large numbers of coins of both, And it's the first time we've had a large group of coins of this particular period. Ceolwulf ruled from 874 to about 879. And what's fascinating about the coins of this period is you can see there's a shared design. So we've got a stylized Roman emperor on one side, and this cross and lozenge on the other side. One at the top is Alfred. Underneath we have Ceolwulf. We've got the same moneyers, Leofwald there, Leafwald there, issuing coins for both. And what we can see is, I don't have time to go into all the detail, but we can see these coins being produced across Mercia and across Wessex, a number of mints, a large number of moneyers. They're also of good silver, whereas the coinage just before this had been of poor silver. What we see is a monetary reform being carried out jointly by the two kings. So although the impression we get from sources written at Alfred's court in the 890s, so half a generation later, are that Ceolwulf is a puppet of the Vikings and appointed by the Vikings, the evidence from the Hoard shows something very different. It shows a monetary alliance between the two kings, with the two of them working very closely together. And indeed, the third figure in this coinage is Ethelred, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This supposed puppet of the Vikings is part of a power package in the south of England and the Midlands that is sanctioned by the church. And this is also reflected in the couple of surviving charters that we have of Ceolwulf. As King of Mercia, so basically King of the Midlands, he's got charters witnessed by people like the Bishop of Worcester, the Bishop of Lichfield. So he's recognised as a proper king. But yet we get this different picture in the historical sources of Alfred's court. Now this is a very substantial coin type, as we now know from this hoard. It was rare prior to this. It is now considerably less rare. And in fact, a second hoard of very similar material turned up at the same time, so much at the same time that initially when the Watlington turned up just a few weeks after the other, I wondered whether it was a missing parcel from the other hoard. I can't unfortunately talk much about that other hoard because some of it did go missing and it's the subject of an ongoing police investigation. That was not properly reported. So, you know, there's swings and roundabouts with metal detecting. But what we do now see from these two hoards is this is a very substantial coinage. But there's another coinage which also is struck with some coins in the name of Alfred, some in the name of Ceolwulf. And this is a very interesting one because on the one side, again, it has a stylized Roman emperor. This is typical of Anglo-Saxon coins generally. But the choice of image on the other side is two emperors with a figure of victory over. Now, with all of the different Roman coins that were available to be copied, and there clearly were a large number because Anglo-Saxon coins copy so many different designs, the fact that this two emperor design is chosen by Alfred and Ceolwulf at the time of their monetary alliance and appears on coins of both of them, I don't think that's coincidence. Whether they would have recognised that as a stylized figure of victory, or whether it would have been seen as an angel in an early medieval Christian context, it's hard to be certain, but either would potentially work for them. There are those who are insistent that this is not what the coin shows. I've had one person emailing me repeatedly to say, can I not see that this is in fact a nativity scene with there's Mary, there's Joseph, there's an angel, and there's the baby Jesus. No, it isn't that. It's two emperors, really. So we've got, here's the Alfred version, and here's the Ceolwulf version. Ceolwulf Rex Merciorum, Ceolwulf, King of the Mercians. We had, previous to this, just one example in the name of each ruler. So it was very difficult to be certain that this was anything other than a one-off special issue. We've now got, I think, 11 more in this hoard and some more in the other hoard that I can't tell you about. So it's now clear this was also a substantial coinage minted by several moneyers across both kingdoms and to this new silver standard. It's a very clear sign of an alliance. And there you can see the two emperors perhaps a little bit more clearly on this one. This was then succeeded in the coinage by a new type of Alfred, and there's one example of this in the Hoard. So one in around 200. That gives us a nice end date for the Hoard. It must be just after this new type has been introduced, but not so much after it that it's become terribly common. What's interesting about this is you can see the design is completely different. No images on it at all. It's been made to be recognisably different from the others. It's also slightly heavier than the others. So Alfred's carrying out a second monetary reform within about 5 years. This dates from probably about 879. And he's chosen to create a heavier coin, heavier and therefore more desirable than the previous coinage, and which looks completely different. I think this explains why coins of that phase where the two kings are working together are so rare. This new coinage was designed to drive those out of circulation, and it's only if they happened to be hoarded during that period of cooperation, or if they fell into the hands of Vikings who, as I said, didn't care what their coins were as long as they were good silver. So you get a few strays in later hoards like the Cúrdal hoards that I showed you earlier. Then they'll survive, but they were deliberately suppressed, and this hoard unlocks that possibility. It's been considered before, but only considered as a very vague possibility because there wasn't enough evidence to say anything very firmly. We've now got so much in the new hoards that we can. So why is all this happening? Well, to understand that, we need to look at the historical context. And this is the historical context of the so-called Great Army. The Great Army arrived in East Anglia in 865, moved around the country, and you can see a map tracing its movements, moving between the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, conquering a number of them. And we can see archaeological evidence of a number of the places that they stayed. It's a very clever strategy. They're campaigning for years at a time, overwintering in a different place each year, taking over estate centres where someone else has gone to the trouble of bringing in all the food for the winter, may turn up and say, thank you very much, we'll have that instead. So they target monasteries, they target royal estates, and doing this in the middle of winter, they're hard to dislodge. And they're using the river system because the Viking ships enable them to do that, so they can use navigable rivers like the Trent as a prime example to come and overwinter, for example, in Nottingham, and even further upstream at Repton in Derbyshire, about as far from the sea as you can get in Britain. But they're able to do this, and up the rivers to York as well, using the Thames and so on. So we've got evidence from a number of these. There's an important site at Torksey in Lincolnshire, again on the Trent, which has been identified through metal detecting, but subsequently has had some archaeological investigation. We can see that the area from which finds have been identified was effectively a natural island, the river on one side and a frozen swamp on the other. So at winter that would be pretty much impassable. And this has produced a variety of objects, weights, hack silver, hack gold again. You can see a Thor's hammer in the middle there, weapons, everyday items as well. We can see from the evidence of sites like this that there were thousands of people, men and women. We've got evidence of female activity on this site as well. So Torksey, a really important site from the early 870s. They then move on to Repton in Derbyshire. Here's an interpretation of the site based on excavations in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Using the church, the monastery at Repton, this was the site of the royal mausoleum of at least one branch of the family. That's still there to see today, well worth a visit if you haven't been. And that church was incorporated into the defences. That neat little D shape that you saw on the previous slide probably is now not accepted by most archaeologists. One end of it was there, the other end wasn't. That it extends under Repton School. So to really get at the truth, we have to flatten Repton School. Is the destruction of the school that produced Jeremy Clarkson too high a price to pay? I think not. It's as previously interpreted, it's a tiny site. There's no doubt that that was the Viking site. There's clear archaeological evidence of that. But I think what they've got is a part of the site there. The site at Torksey is 50 times the size. They couldn't have crammed into such a small space the next year. They then carry on. The group divides. One group went up to the north of England and settled in Yorkshire. And there's this wonderful Viking camp, again, many times the size of Repton, which is again has produced coins, weights, bullion. You can see the hilt of a sword there as well. They then continue. Another group goes down to East Anglia and down to Wessex, and we've got weights from Wareham, where they went in 876, and from Wareham they went to Exeter, but were chased away pretty quickly, moved up to Gloucester, so over into the Mercian kingdom again. And now we're getting into the context of this hoard, because in the middle of the winter, at the end of 877, they come across the border and attack the royal estate of Chippenham. Alfred was taken by surprise. Whether or not they were actually trying to capture Alfred or whether they just wanted his food supplies is a moot point. But Alfred was forced into hiding, spent the next few months burning cakes and so on, but then came back, won a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. There's a treaty with the Viking leader Guthrum, who's forced to accept Christianity, and has Alfred as his godfather, and he retreats back across the border, just across into Mercia, and then stays there for another year, and that's all we're told. And then he moves on to East Anglia, and the route from Cirencester, where he overwintered the next year, up to East Anglia, there's a trackway, the Ridgeway, that covers much of that journey. To get from Cirencester here to the Ridgeway, there's two Roman roads that he could have taken, one of which sort of loops up, one of which loops down. The lower of those two passes just by Watlington. And this is exactly the right sort of time. It's 879 before he moves on. But what's happening at this time? This is just the point that Ceolwulf mysteriously disappears from history. Ceolwulf just disappears without a trace. We only know when his reign ended because there's a Mercian list of kings which said he ruled for 5 years. So he disappears at some point during the year that Guthrum and his army have moved into his kingdom, effectively with Alfred's blessing as his godfather. Guthrum then moves across to East Anglia, and we have then another treaty surviving from just after this between Alfred and Guthrum, where they basically carve up Ceolwulf's kingdom between them. So the southwest part of it, they follow the River Lee up from the Thames, and then there's a couple of wiggles, and then they reach the A5, and everything to the east of that is Guthrum's, everything to the west of that is Alfred's. So they divide up Mercia, and it's very interesting that these records from Alfred's court, anything that they can possibly say to the credit of Alfred and his family, they do. You'd think they'd mention something like getting hold of possession of an important neighbouring kingdom, especially since they then go on to tell us how he becomes king of the Angles and the Angles and the Saxons, and basically anyone who'd have him, including some of the Welsh as well. But they never tell us how he got hold of Mercia. So that's quite a substantial thing to miss out. So what the Hoard shows us is we've got basically an alliance between Alfred and Ceolwulf, which is reflected in the coinage, and which immediately after this, around the time the hoard was buried, is just wiped out of history. It's a sort of Stalinist airbrushing out of history 15 years or so later, someone that it's no longer convenient to remember. And he just quietly obtains Mercia, and there's the foundation of the English kingdom. But it's a foundation which at this point leaves the whole of northern and eastern England in Viking hands, with Alfred controlling probably up to about here, and with this still to re-establish firm control over, but with no strong Viking settlement. So there's a situation in 880, the foundation of the beginnings of an English kingdom, but one that's founded possibly on treachery and the betrayal of an ally in favour of a new alliance with the Vikings. A bit of a difference from the heroic defence against the Vikings, which is certainly part of the story, but which I think is not the whole story. And this pattern then continues when we go into the 10th century with Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, Alfred's daughter, Ethelflaed, who was married to now an ealdorman rather than a king of Mercia, and who then ruled Mercia effectively after her husband's death, but under her brother, accepting her brother's kingship over the whole thing. And then we get Edward's son, Athelstan, who actually unites everything. And this is where we come to our next hoard. And this is the Vale of York hoard. And this was found in 2007. And I've been working on it since about a week after it came out of the ground. Again, this was properly reported. The metal detectorists who found it first, everything was inside that cup. So all of it was packed in there. The larger ingots were on top, and then it's been wrapped around with sheet lead to hold it all together, a bit like putting tin foil around to hold it all together. And it had stayed intact until a plough had hit it, shattered the lead, dented the vessel slightly. And when the detectorists initially found it, they did take it out of the ground because they thought that they'd found a ballcock and cistern. Then they realised that ballcocks don't normally contain Anglo-Saxon coins because they were starting to fall out. But again, they resisted the temptation to empty it, and it came down to the British Museum, and a colleague and I emptied it a centimetre at a time to see whether there was any significance as to what had been put in what order. As it happens, there wasn't, but we can say that definitively, which we couldn't have done otherwise, so that in itself is useful. So it's an amazing hoard, and it's a very lovely one, and you can see it again across the way. The star of it is this cup. This is a church vessel. It's Frankish workmanship, so northern France, Netherlands, Western Germany, that sort of area, 9th century. It's gilt on the inside as well as the outside. It's got religious motifs. I don't have time to go into it, but it's almost certainly looted from a church or monastery, but then probably reused as the drinking cup of a Viking chieftain. There's a wonderful gold armouring, unusual to have gold in basically a silver hoard, but not unparalleled, and some silver armourings. Also quite a lot of fragmentary silver. That's the pin from the back of a pair of brooches, so the bead in the middle would have had another chain going out to another pin and a pair of brooches with the bead in between. We've got, this is a fragment from a brooch from the Irish Sea area. The closest parallel, incidentally, to that pin and bead is from a Viking hoard in Russia that we found. So we're seeing that wider Viking world extending from the Irish Sea as far as Russia. And here we've got a fragment of one of those Russian-type arm rings or neck rings that I was telling you about, just chopped up, and it's made it over here. And there are other fragments in Viking hoards from Britain as well. And again, there's quite a lot of coins, 617 coins in total. And what we have is a mixture of Alfred's coins from just after that last hoard onwards. So this starts where Watlington stops. So it's the post-reform coins of Alfred, continuing then through Edward the Elder, through the early part of Athelstan's reign, but we also have a number of Viking types, and we have 15 Islamic coins and 4 Frankish coins from the continent. So the most common type is the 2-line type of Edward the Elder. It's got Edward's name and title. Edward Rex, they're very careful at this point not to say where they're kings of, because it was an expanding kingdom. So they were leaving the door open to be king of more. So we see this on Alfred's later coins and Edward's, and the beginning of Athelstan as well. And then the money is named in 2 lines on the other type. We've also, though, got the Viking coins, and these, particularly the coins of this sword type. And these, some of these have the name of St. Peter, and these typically have a York mint signature on the back. The inscription is slightly blundered on this one, it's not entirely clear, but it's trying to say Sancti, abbreviated Petri Moneta, with this sword. We also have some with the name Sitric Rex, King Sitric. Sitric is the Viking king of Northumbria from 921 to 927. And I'll come back to him in a moment. But we also have Islamic coins from as far away as modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. So again, right across the Viking world, and they're Frankish coins as well. And as with the previous hoard, we can date the hoard very precisely because it ends just after a coin reform. We've got one example of this coin type of Athelstan. It becomes the dominant type of his reign. You can see it's very clear and freshly struck. So again, the hoard's been buried just after he's introduced this type, but before it's had the chance to become very common. And unlike these other coins that just call him King Athelstan, this is quite specific about where he's king of. So we've got Athelstan Rex Tobri, that's short for Totius Britanniae, king of all Britain. So he's expanded his claims, and that enables us to date this coin reform quite precisely. It almost certainly follows a meeting at Emont Bridge, just outside modern Penrith, in July 927, and he met the king of the Scots, the king of Strathclyde, which at that point covered Cumbria and a big chunk of southwest Scotland, and various Viking leaders, and was accepted, we're told, as their overlord. And having this one example and no others, and then all these large numbers of slightly earlier coins, tells us very clearly it's buried in that sort of period, late 927, early 928, probably on a Tuesday. It's that sort of time. Now, again, this is an interesting historical context, and we have to see this in terms of the expansion of England under Alfred and his successors. Alfred had successfully fought off the Vikings, first that attack by Guthrum and then later attacks in the 890s. He establishes a series of fortified towns across Wessex and expanding up into that bit of Mercia that was his after that treaty with Guthrum the Viking. Under his successors, we see the narrative that we're given in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of the conquest. It's portrayed almost as a reconquest, and that's how modern historians have normally seen it until relatively recently. Just a reconquest of something that never belonged to the Anglo or the West Saxons in the first place. But this conquest of the Midlands and East Anglia, Edward pushing up in the east and his sister Ethelflaed pushing up in the west and taking over a town at a time. And this is one of the interesting features of this period. This is when urbanization really gets going in England, with both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons having fortified towns as a concentration of defense against enemies, but also as centers of royal authority and power, and kingship suddenly becomes much more organized and powerful as a result. So we've seen the standard Edward coin, the 2-line type. What we also see in the West Midlands is a number of different varieties, almost certainly struck in Edward's name, but under the authority of his sister Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. So there's a variety of floral types. There's also this type, and there's 1.5 examples of this in the Hoard. We're getting those cut halves that I talked about coming in. It shows, well, is it a fortified town? Is it a church? Opinion is divided amongst scholars. I think it's a fortified town because I'm more interested in fortified towns than churches. But you can read it either way. To some extent, it doesn't really matter. What it's representing is the expansion into the West Midlands and potentially further north of Anglo-Saxon kingship, which takes with it both Christianity and fortified towns. So it can be both at once. What's interesting is this type has normally been seen as linked specifically to the Midlands, but this one, it's got the moneyer's name, Walter, and then Eo. That's normally the beginning of Eoverwick, the Anglo-Saxon name for York. So it may be being minted in York as well. But we don't have a clear indication in the sources of Edward ever having conquered York. It's possible that he did, because once again, the Hoard evidence suggests we don't get a complete picture. He may have conquered it and then lost it again, in which case we can understand why the Chronicle might not mention him having had it in the first place. They can concentrate on his son's successful conquest of it a few years later. Now, I mentioned the sword types that we have. We've got 3 varieties known of this St. Peter type from York. And all the ones in this Hoard are of this variety here, which is actually, I think, the latest in the Hoard. So they start with this one, St. Peter with a sword there, Thor's hammer on the other side. Second variety, St. Peter and a sword, again, Thor's hammer there. And then the third type, it's been replaced with a cross. But Thor's hammer is still there. The eye of the name Petri has become the handle of a very small Thor's hammer. What's going on here? Well, I think this is the conversion process. This is Christianity doing what it's always been good at, taking over other religions rather than just conflicting with them, saying, yeah, you can carry on worshipping Thor as long as you call him St. Peter now. The sword, perhaps the sword with which Peter at Gethsemane defends Christ against his enemies, the hammer with which Thor defends the gods against their enemies, the giants, is drawing a parallel. It's saying, yeah, this is a saint you can respect as a Viking. So we have this group definitely minted in York. We have 3 other sword types. This one in the name of St. Martin with a clear Lincoln mint signature. Then we've got a group, and we've got 2 of these in the Hoard, in the name of Sitric. Sitric is recorded as the king of Northumbria, but most of these are not found north of the Humber. The St. Peter ones are mostly found north of the Humber. Sitric tends to be found in the Midlands. And we've already got clear evidence of this same type being minted in Lincoln as one of these in the Hoard as well. Then we've got this type. This is referred to as the anonymous sword type, because until recently, the only examples we had of it have a jumbled up inscription. In fact, we've got 2 examples now which also say Sitric Rex. So these are also Sitric types, and both of those come from East Nottinghamshire. So it's possible these may even have been minted in Nottingham, but it seems very likely that these were a Midlands issue, despite the fact that we see Sitric as a Northumbrian king. The Hoard also contained a new sword variety, and on one side it's got the moneyer's name, Otard, and then Mott, short for Moneta, Moneyer, and then it's got a place name here, Roriva Castor, and Castor place names are very common in Viking context, indicating a former Roman fortification. So this is minted not at York, but definitely at the settlement of Roriva Castor. Unfortunately, this is the only bit of evidence we've ever got for somewhere being called Roriva Castor, so we have to work out where it might have been. I've suggested, in terms of following a parallel development to the development of the name of Rochester in Kent, that this could actually be Roster in Staffordshire, going from a hypothetical original Roman name, Dura Brevi Castra, and we don't know that Roster was called that, I should say. So this is very much a theory, not established fact. Fortification at the Strong Bridge, and Roster is at the confluence of two rivers, so it is a fortification at a bridge. So I'm not just completely making it up as I go along. But going hypothetically as a development into the forms that we first have it, it could fit there. And Roster, for those of you not familiar with it, which is probably most people, it's only really known for JCB today, but it's on one of the main routes between the Irish Sea and the heartlands of Viking settlement in the East Midlands. So assuming that people coming in either to the Thames or the Dee to this area around Chester, you've got a direct route up to York, you've got a route down here into the West Midlands, and there's a major battle down here in 910 as well. But you've also got a route across to Derby, Nottingham, Lincoln, Leicester, Stamford, the concentration of towns in the centre. Roster would make sense as a Viking settlement here. Now, I can't say for certain that that's the case. Another place that we do know was called Dura Brevi in the Roman period and survives as Castor today, so with that other element, is here just outside Stamford. So that's another possibility. But it's definitely a Viking type, and it fits into this wider pattern of Viking coins minted York, Lincoln, and somewhere in the Midlands. Now, again, what's interesting about this is that the account that we have of Edward's reign has him in control at 920 of everything up to the River Humber. And there's no record either of him losing that control or of that control being lost on his death in 924. So as far as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is concerned, there's just a continuous linear progression, the boundary of the expanding England being pushed up to the Humber by 920. But I don't think the hoard fits that, and this coinage generally doesn't fit it. We've also, within the hoard, got a large number of coins of this type, and this is a type with buildings on it, some of which have, again, a York mint signature on, so they're definitely minted in York. These are an early type of Athelstan, an early and short-lived type of Athelstan, and normally very, very rare. We've got about as many in this hoard as all the other known examples put together, which again helps us date this quite precisely. So we've got a number from York, and then we've got a number of other ones which have a moneyer's name. So this has got Frotia and Mon for Moneta on it, the moneyer's name Frotia. Now, if we look at those money names and link them with moneyers who are recorded either on Viking issues or later coins of Athelstan with the mint names on as well, what we can actually see is that all of these can be linked either with Citrix coins or with coins of Athelstan from the Midlands. So what this seems to be is a celebration, just as Edward's coins with a tower on had been a celebration of conquering his way up through the Midlands. Athelstan, I think, is doing exactly the same thing. He has this short-lived coinage celebrating the conquest of the Midlands and York, and it has to fit in before that period in 927 when he meets all those other kings and starts calling himself King of all Britain. So it's got to be early 927 or a little before that. Now, what's very interesting about this is that there's an account of a meeting between Athelstan and the Viking ruler Sitric at Tamworth in 926, and Athelstan married one of his sisters off to Sitric. It's an alliance, but the following year Sitric died and Athelstan moved north and took control of his kingdom, and his brother tried to get it back but was booted out. So Athelstan really does unite England to a great extent at this period. That meeting at Tamworth has often been interpreted as a meeting at Tamworth because it was, according to some, the ancient capital of Mercia. This is a myth put about by the Tamworth Tourist Board. There was no ancient capital of Mercia. It was an important royal estate, but there wasn't a capital in that sense. I think the reason that the meeting took place at 926, in 926 at Tamworth, was that was then the border. And I think we've got another episode which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle basically fails to remember to tell us about. And so if we follow the sequence of events, in 920, as I said, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Edward the Elder had pushed control, Edward and his sister Ethelflaed between them had pushed control right up to the Humber. There's a meeting, we're told at that point, at Bakewell in Derbyshire. That meeting is then effectively on that new northern border. However, either in the last years of Edward's life or perhaps on his death, control of a large amount of this newly conquered land was lost. And that's the bit that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just forgets to mention. So the boundary is perhaps pushed further back, and we've got Sitrick described as King of Northumbria, but controlling and minting coins in the whole of this area across the Midlands. And with the meeting at Tamworth, therefore, again being a border meeting, not in the heart of Athelstan's kingdom. There's an earlier parallel to this a few years ago, which only occurred to me the other day, so I haven't yet made a map of it. There's a meeting at a town in Buckinghamshire a few years earlier, when again that was the border. So there seems to be this tradition of border meetings. And then in 927, we've got the meeting at Emont Bridge. By this time, Athelstan has now got control of this area. The Viking coins stop. He's now minting these coins on which he proclaims himself King of all Britain. And with some justification. It's a slight boast, but the King of Scots does turn up witnessing some of his charters. When he stopped behaving, Athelstan took a fleet up to Scotland to reinforce his control, and when the Scots and the Strathclyde British and the Vikings allied to try and break Athelstan's power at Brunanburh in 937, they were unsuccessful. So Athelstan could make a pretty strong claim to be king, at least of all England and in a loose sense of all Britain. But the story again is not quite as simple as it would appear, because although in the south of England they're minting these nice coins calling him King of all Britain, it's clear that in this part of the world people weren't so keen to have a West Saxon ruling them. And these aren't in the Hoard, but they're known from other sources. Here we've got Athelstan Rex Totius Britanniae, various contractions of this. All the southern coins call him that. He's King of all Britain, there's no doubt of that. As far as Nottingham and Derby are concerned, he's King of the Saxons. He's not one of us, he doesn't rule us, he's a nasty southerner, and who does he think he is, calling himself King of all Britain? So it's not quite as straightforward as that. He does have rule in the Midlands, he does have rule in the north, but even that is not welcomed by everyone, and there's a limit to how far his power extends in the north, because even in the north, Emont Bridge and Penrith remains the border, and that again is reflected in the Hoard evidence. Another hoard that turned up a few years ago from Furness in Cumbria. This is from the 950s. There's another episode I don't have time to go into when after Athelstan's death the Vikings break away and control has to be reinserted. And that throughout the 940s, early 950s, that's happening. But this hoard, buried in the 950s, is after that English authority is re-established. But this is a hoard from Furness in Cumbria, and I just got everything nicely set in my mind with the chronology of the hoards and the sort of economy that was established on the basis of the Hoards and the history, all fitting neatly together, and then someone had to find this Viking hoard with coins, but also, as you can see, with hack silver and ingots. And it's a mixed hoard, and there shouldn't be a Viking hoard in England in the mid to late 950s. And then I remembered, it isn't in England, because although we talk about England in these sort of slightly anachronistic way, the hoard's found here. So this isn't England yet. So I don't have to rewrite that bit after all. So to conclude, what we see if we look at the hoard evidence is an emerging picture of an English nation being formed out of the ruins of the former kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. The broad pattern of it, the broad chronology of it, remains very much as we get in the sources that have come down to us through the West Saxon court, the court of the dynasty that benefited from that unification and used that unification to extend their own power into a much larger kingdom than any Anglo-Saxon king had ruled before, and probably than any Anglo-Saxon king could realistically have conceived of. It did happen. The unification was a real event. It gives us eventually the England we know today. But it didn't take place as straightforwardly or as heroically and patriotically as the story has come down to us. So it's a reminder that when we look at historical sources, we need to look at them very, very carefully, and ideally we need to look at them in the light of the Hoards. Thank you.